A final recognition that this wasn't about crime. It was about love, sacrifice, and a dog who never stopped believing. They didn't walk out like prisoners. They didn't walk out like heroes. They walked out like shadows turning toward the sun for the first time in years. No cheers, no speeches, no parade. Just footsteps on stone, just a man in torn boots, and a dog whose tail, for the first time in weeks, wagged freely. The cameras outside didn't matter. The headlines would come and go. But for Jackson Cole, that door swinging open wasn't freedom. It was forgiveness. 3 days later. An old bench outside a rundown VA shelter. Jackson sat there quietly, Ranger curled up at his feet. The world moved around them. People passed. Buses sighed. A mother yelled after her child. But inside, there was stillness. The kind you feel in the final pages of a book you never wanted to finish. A quiet voice approached. It was the judge. She wasn't wearing the robe now, just a gray coat and tired eyes. She sat beside Jackson. Didn't speak at first, just handed him a file. Inside, a new ID, housing approval, service animal protection tag, a worn military dog tag. With blood rust still etched into the metal, Jackson stared at it, hands trembling slightly. It belonged to Staff Sergeant Julian Reeve, she whispered. The man whose widow brought your letter. He insisted you have it, if this day ever came. Jackson swallowed hard. The tag was heavier than it looked. Soft bark. Ranger lifted his head, ears alert, then gently nudged Jackson's thigh. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the sidewalk. People passed by again, but some of them, they slowed. A boy pointed. Is that the dog from TV? His mother hushed him gently, but she smiled. Another man approached and nodded. Hey, I serve too. Semper Fi. Jackson nodded back. Said nothing, but his eyes, they weren't hollow anymore. The city buzzed. Billboards changed. People forgot. But not everyone. In a small-town courtroom 3 states over, a judge passed a new ruling. Inspired by one case, veterans with certified service dogs could now receive emergency medical access for their animals under state protection. A law sparked not by protest, but by the silent weight of one man's refusal to be invisible. 1 week later, Ranger stood still outside a cemetery gate. He wouldn't move until Jackson whispered, "Go ahead, boy." The old shepherd walked forward. Slow, careful. They stopped at a stone marked, Sergeant Reeve, beloved husband, loyal soldier. Never forgot. Jackson bent down, placed the rusted dog tag at the foot of the stone. Then, he did something he hadn't done in years. He saluted. Long, silent, with tears running down his face. Not from grief, but relief. They left the graveyard as quietly as they had entered. No one followed. No one needed to, because some stories don't need an audience. Some battles are won simply by surviving. Back in the city, Jackson finally unlocked the door to his new apartment. It was modest, a bed, a small kitchen, a couch. But on the wall, a photo had already been hung, a courtroom, Ranger sitting beside him, the entire room standing. It was blurry, not well framed, taken on an old phone by a stranger, but in the frame, you could feel something eternal. Later that night, Jackson fell asleep on the couch, Ranger curled at his feet, and for the first time in years, he didn't wake up screaming, he didn't toss. He didn't dream of sirens or gunfire or broken things. He just slept, the kind of sleep that only comes after a war has finally ended. The screen fades to black. A single line appears. Not all heroes wear medals. Some just never let go. Then, a faint sound, a soft bark, and the quiet click of claws on a hardwood floor. But the judge lifted her hand. Let him. The court froze. Ranger walked slowly toward Kane's chair. His movements calculated, silent, like when he once stalked through war zones to sniff out explosives. Kane chuckled nervously. Is this legal? The judge didn't respond. Ranger reached him and then... And... He stopped, sniffed once, twice. Eyes still locked on Kane's face. Then his body went rigid, and without warning, he growled, a low, guttural growl that hadn't been heard since the battlefield. Jackson rose from his seat instinctively. "Ranger." "Stand down." But Ranger didn't move. His growl became a snarl. His eyes flared with something deeper than anger. Recognition, not of a face, but of a scent, the same scent from that day in the valley. The one who abandoned them under fire, who fled while Jackson dragged 2 men to safety, who left a trap and blamed it on enemy fire. Ranger remembered it all, the smell of cowardice, the fear, the betrayal. And now, it sat there in a suit. The courtroom was stunned. The judge spoke gently. "Mr. Kane, were you ever investigated for misconduct during deployment?" He shifted in his chair. "No official charges were filed." "That's not what I asked." Kane swallowed. "No, Your Honor. I wasn't formally investigated." The judge turned to the clerk. "Pull his military records now." Murmurs broke out. The prosecutor looked pale. Kane tried to speak, but the damage was already done. The jury's faces were changing. Something wasn't right. They could feel it. The judge leaned forward. "This court isn't here to evaluate military conduct. But if a witness carries a grudge, if testimony is clouded by personal vendetta, this jury must weigh that." Kane stood. "This is a circus. That dog's behavior isn't evidence." But even as he yelled, Ranger didn't bark. He just stared, and in that stare, the truth burned through the lies, like fire through dry grass. Back in the gallery, a woman stood quietly. No one had noticed her enter. She wore simple clothes, a faded army widow's pin. She stepped forward, holding an envelope. The bailiff tried to stop her, but the judge spoke first. "Let her pass." The woman walked to the front and handed the envelope to the judge. Her voice broke as she whispered, "This was mailed to me by a man who died in Jackson Cole's arms. My husband?" His final words were about the dog and the man who didn't run. The judge opened the letter. "Read." Silence fell like snowfall. Then she looked up. Her eyes glistened. She turned to Jackson. "Is this true?" Jackson didn't speak. He just looked at Ranger and nodded once. The unraveling had begun, not in the form of angry shouts, but quiet truths, buried stories, and the slow crumbling of a lie dressed in a suit. Ranger sat again, not with pride, but with the weary poise of a soldier who'd done his job. He had smelled the truth, dragged it out, and placed it at the feet of justice. The judge set the letter down. "There will be a recess. This court has much to reconsider." She stood, but before she could leave the bench, she paused, stared at Jackson, then at the dog beside him, and then she whispered his name, Sergeant Jackson Cole. Gasps, a beat passed, then another. Every single person in the courtroom rose, the jury, the gallery, even the officers, because somehow they knew they were not in the presence of a criminal. They were in the presence of a hero. The courtroom emptied like a wave pulling back from shore. People whispered, lingered, stared, not because of what they saw, but because of what they had just felt. Sergeant Jackson Cole didn't move. Ranger lay at his side, chin resting on his paws, but eyes still tracking every step, every voice. He wasn't relaxed, he was waiting. Outside the door, cameras had already started flashing. But Jackson, he was somewhere else, back in that ruined valley, back where he'd last believed in the system. Recess. 20 minutes. The judge's chambers were dark, lit only by a desk lamp. The widow who had brought the letter now sat with Jackson. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. "He wrote to me about you," she whispered. "About how you didn't run. About how that dog—" She looked at Ranger. "Dragged his bleeding body back while you covered them both with one bullet left." Jackson didn't respond. She placed her hand gently over his. He said if you ever showed up in court, he hoped someone would listen. Back in the main chamber, the judge returned, firm but shaken. She sat, eyes flicking between the prosecutor, the defense, and Jackson. "I have reviewed the letter. I've also received a preliminary readout on Mr. Kane's military record. While we'll address that separately, there is now enough evidence of tampered testimony to proceed carefully." A hush fell. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, with this new information, we would like to request a suspension of charges." Jackson stood. "No, Gasps. Even the defense attorney turned. Sergeant Cole. Jackson stepped forward, slow, deliberate, eyes still sunken but voice full. I don't want it dismissed. The judge blinked. Explain. He looked out at the courtroom, then down at Ranger. Dismissal says I didn't. Do it. But I did break in. I did what they said. And I'd do it again. A murmur. He raised his voice, steady now, but not for painkillers, not for escape. I broke in for antibiotics. Ranger was dying, infected gash, refused at 2 clinics, turned away at a VA that wouldn't even see me. I watched this dog save my life more times than I can count. I wasn't going to let him die in the dark. He looked at the judge. You. Call it trespassing. I call it a rescue op. Silence. Then Ranger stood slowly, as if understanding every word. He walked to Jackson and sat beside him. And the room? It leaned forward like it was holding its breath. A woman from the jury stood. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge hesitated. This isn't protocol, but Jackson nodded. Let her. The woman spoke slowly. My son came back from Afghanistan, PTSD, night terrors, couldn't eat, couldn't hold a job. Her voice cracked. Then he got a canine support dog, said it was the first time he felt human again. That dog saved his life, more than the medicine ever did. She turned toward Jackson, eyes glassy. If you ask me, that dog, she looked at Ranger, was the medicine. The judge stood, stunned, and then the bailiff rushed forward. Your Honor, incoming order from the mayor's office. Media's picked up the story. They're outside the courthouse. There's hundreds. The judge exhaled sharply, then turned. Back toward Jackson. You realize if we proceed with a guilty plea, it's on your record. No pension, no benefits, no reversal. I know. Why would you do this? He paused, looked at Ranger, and then spoke. Because I want the world to know that he's worth it. The judge slowly returned to her bench. Then I sentence. Sergeant Jackson Cole to time served. No, again, Jackson interrupted. I don't want a pass, I want a message. He stepped forward, his voice finally rising. There are others out there. Vets with nothing. Sleeping in alleys with dogs who still wake them up from nightmares. We don't want pity. We want one damn moment where someone looks at us and says, I see you. I believe you. That's all. He looked at Ranger. And I want this moment to mean something. The judge's hands trembled now, and then she nodded. The gavel never dropped. Instead, the judge stood, slowly, respectfully. Sergeant Jackson Cole. This court recognizes your actions as unlawful, but not unjustified. Your service, your integrity, and your loyalty have spoken louder than any charge ever could. She paused, looked at Ranger, and to the K9 who stood with you when no one else did. I see him, I believe him. She stepped down from the bench, stood directly before the two, and then she saluted, not with protocol, not with obligation, with something deeper, something sacred, and in that still moment, the entire courtroom followed suit. Lawyers, bailiffs, spectators, even the jury. One by one they stood, in silence. A salute, not to a man, but to a bond forged in blood and loyalty. Everything was blurry. The world never fully returned after the war, but the dog was always sharp, always present. When everything else vanished, Ranger stayed. 10 years. 2 forgotten souls. One bond that couldn't be broken, not by bullets, not by fire. Not by the country that turned its back, but the trial had only just begun and neither of them knew. The real betrayal was still coming. Jackson sat at the defense table as if he were still deployed, back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. But inside everything twisted. He didn't understand the system anymore, didn't understand how a man could risk his life for a flag, then be hunted by the very country he bled for, over dog medicine. The court clerk called out charges, like reading ingredients off a cereal box, breaking and entering. Theft of controlled substances, trespassing, resisting arrest. Jackson blinked slowly. He'd never resisted. He dropped to his knees the second the sirens wailed. Ranger had simply stood beside him, unmoving. The defense attorney whispered, "You have to speak up, Mr. Cole. They're trying to push for time, months, maybe years." But he was already somewhere else. He was in a combat zone where men yelled instead of listened, where no one cared what you said, only what you looked. Like when they found you. The betrayal didn't start in court. It started long before. 3 years ago, Jackson walked into a government building with a folder full of his medical records and Ranger's discharge papers. He waited 6 hours for someone to say his name. They never did. When he finally approached the desk, a woman with glossy nails and tired eyes looked him over like gum on the sidewalk. "No appointment, no entry." "Next." "But Mom, I served. My dog, he's limping real bad. I need—" She cut him off without looking up. "That's not my department." Next day, Jackson tried the VA hospital. They told him there was no funding for military dogs. "Unless he's registered as a pet," they said. "But he's not a pet. Then he's not our problem." The words never left his ears. In court, the prosecutor was building a story. A cold one. One that ignored the leash, ignored the dog tags, ignored the limp in both man and animal. He pointed at Jackson. He entered private property with intent to take controlled substances. Regardless of his past, the law is the law. Then came the low blow. He was found with syringes, no prescription. "Your Honor, and that is classic addict behavior." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the young lawyer flinched. Jackson turned his head slowly. Eyes narrowed. No anger, just disappointment. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. Looked down at Ranger. The dog stared back, eyes still, unmoving. They'd been through worse. They didn't need to scream. They just needed someone to finally see. But the world had a way of kicking you while you were already on the ground. During lunch recess, Jackson was escorted to a side room for holding. 2 officers. No words. They locked the door behind them, left him and Ranger alone. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The silence made Jackson's ears ring. Then the door cracked. Open, and a man walked in. Civilian clothes, crisp suit, polished shoes, too clean, too calm. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't sit. He just stared. Jackson didn't move. Neither did Ranger. The man finally said, "You don't remember me, do you?" Jackson's brow creased. The voice was familiar, faint, from another life. "I served under you. Echo Squad. You were a god to us back then." "It's back." He smiled, but there was venom in it. Funny how the mighty fall. Jackson's heart sank. He remembered now. Private Kane. Too reckless, too loud. Always blamed others for his mistakes. Got sent home early after a friendly fire incident. Disappeared. From the army. Now here he was, wearing a suit, eyes cold, and working somehow for the prosecution. "You're not here to testify," Jackson murmured. "No. I'm here to bury you." Kane leaned in, whispering, "You made sure they discharged me, said I was unstable. That report followed me for years." Jackson stared back. "You pointed a rifle at our own men." Kane shrugged. "Details." He straightened his coat. "But now you're the one in chains, and I'm the man holding the keys." Then he looked at Ranger. "Still got your dog, huh? Thought they put those things down." In a blink, Ranger stood, not barking, not growling, just standing, teeth slightly exposed. A silent warning. Kane stepped back. "Still got bite, huh? We'll see how long that lasts when he's taken from you." Jackson felt it in his chest like shrapnel. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for Ranger. The system had already labeled the dog evidence. If Jackson went to prison, Ranger would be separated. Permanently. His only family. His only reason for staying alive this long. The betrayal wasn't just the courtroom. It was the country. The silence. The system that left both of them behind and now came back to punish them for surviving. Back in the gallery, the judge returned to her bench. But her eyes were heavier now. She could feel it. Something about this case wasn't right. Something was being hidden, and she knew. The dog knew it too. Ranger had sat quietly all morning, but suddenly, as the bailiff opened the side door, the fee. Dog rose to his feet, tail stiff, head forward, eyes fixed on the man who walked back into the courtroom. Private Kane. Now a witness. But Ranger didn't forget. He remembered everything, and his body began to shake, not from fear, but rage. The past was coming back. And this time the courtroom was about to feel the truth. The courtroom was silent. But the tension hung in the air like smoke before a fire breaks. All eyes turned to the man walking toward the witness stand. Private Kane, or whatever name he went by now, trimmed beard, silk tie, lying smile. Jackson didn't blink. Ranger didn't sit. The dog remained upright, his stare locked on Kane with unnatural stillness. The judge noticed it too. Her eyes darted toward the German shepherd, then toward the Marine beside him, and something inside her began to shift. She cleared her throat. "Please state your name for the record." Kane adjusted the microphone, smiling for the jury like it was a camera. "Derek Kane, civilian contractor, former Army Infantry, Echo Squad, 7th Battalion." A pause. Jackson could almost hear the bullets behind those words. Echo Squad, the same unit that bled in the valley where everything changed. But Kane's voice was syrup now. "I served with Mr. Jackson Cole, briefly, before disciplinary issues ended my tour." He smiled, made it sound like a handshake disagreement. Not like a disaster where men nearly died because of him. The defense attorney stood. "Objection, irrelevant. The witness isn't testifying as an expert or character reference." Kane held up a hand. "I just want to speak the truth." The judge stared at him, then nodded, slowly. "You have 1 minute." Kane leaned forward. The courtroom leaned with him. "I remember a man obsessed with his dog, even more than his unit, a man who followed orders until he didn't. And when he got me sent home, he made sure my record was blacked out forever. But I moved on, got a new life." Then his voice darkened. "But some men, they don't change, they just get older and desperate." He turned to the jury. "And when you're living on the streets with no one, not even a bed, sometimes that dog becomes your only addiction." Gasps. A few jurors looked away. Kane finished with a dagger. He didn't break into that clinic for painkillers. He broke in for dog meds. That animal is his only reason to wake up. That's not loyalty, that's obsession. Ranger didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. Then something happened. A sound broke the silence, a low, deliberate whimper. Not loud. Not forced. Just the sound of a soul remembering something it had buried for years. Ranger took one step forward, then another. The bailiff moved. The chains clinked against the cold tile floor as the bailiff led him through the back entrance of the courtroom. All heads turned, some out of curiosity, others out of habit. But no one expected the figure that appeared through the swinging door. Tall. Thin, face hollow from hunger and something deeper, a shadow of medals long buried beneath the weight of survival. His uniform was a tattered hoodie stained with time. His boots didn't match. One army-issued, one taken from a shelter bin. But what followed beside him stopped every heartbeat in the room. A German shepherd, leaning close to the man's leg, calm, precise, unnervingly alert. Scar over one eye, tattooed ID number on the ear, muzzle grey not from age, but from trauma, a canine war dog. And yet, they entered not as heroes. They entered in chains. The judge looked up. She froze. The gavel nearly slipped from her hand. He didn't make eye contact with her. Didn't even look up. He just walked slowly toward the defense table. The bailiff unhooked the chain from his wrists and paused, confused, unsure what to do about the dog. The German shepherd sat, silent, eyes never blinking. The courtroom was still, not out of respect, but confusion. Who was this man? Why was a war dog chained to him like a criminal? What crime puts a veteran on trial, with a dog that still wore a military tag? An older white prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant—" "Name," the judge cut him off, voice thin and trembling. "State his full name." The E. Defense attorney, a woman barely out of law school, looked down at her folder. She stood, her voice cracked. "Jackson Cole, ma'am." Silence. Something shifted in the room. A breath held too long, suddenly released. The judge stood, slowly, deliberately. One by one, the court clerks rose to their feet behind her, then the stenographer, then the two officers guarding the hallway, even the prosecutor, confused but instinctively. Following suit, the bailiff looked around uncertain, then stood too. Everyone in the courtroom was now standing, except Jackson Cole. And the dog. He still hadn't looked up. He stared only at his dog, one hand resting gently behind its ear. His other hand trembled, not from fear, but from memory. And then the judge whispered, "You're not supposed to be alive." Jackson slowly lifted his head, eyes full of rust and rain. A 1,000-yard stare sharpened by betrayal, softened only by the animal beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The German shepherd let out the softest sound, a single breath, almost a sigh, and laid his head against Jackson's thigh. And in that moment, everyone saw it. This wasn't a man on trial. This was a ghost of war. Forgotten. By the country he once bled for, held together only by the loyalty of a dog who remembered what the world chose to forget, but none of them knew the truth yet, not the judge. Not the young attorney shaking beside him, not the crowd murmuring behind the gallery, not even Jackson himself. Because this wasn't just a trial. This was the final chapter of something buried so deep, no one dared to dig. But the dog knew, and he had waited years for this moment. 10 years earlier, he was Staff Sergeant Jackson Cole, Echo Squad, 4th Battalion. One of the most respected handlers in the Army's K9 unit, they called him Shadow, not because he was silent, but because the German shepherd at his side, Ranger, never left his. Missions blurred together. Dust storms, blackouts, IEDs, hidden in playgrounds, snipers perched in shattered mosques, and through it all, Ranger, trained to track explosives, trained to protect his handler, trained to kill if necessary, but nothing trained either of them for what came after. 1 week before discharge, they were hit. The convoy never saw it coming. 3 vehicles blown apart like paper dolls, bodies scattered across a dirt road like discarded uniforms. Ranger dragged Jackson from the fire. He bit through a belt to make a tourniquet. He stood guard with a torn leg until rescue arrived. He survived. They both did. But something in Jackson didn't come back with the helicopter. In the courtroom, Jackson's eyes flickered as the judge called for recess. He didn't rise, didn't speak. He just reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, creased photograph. A younger version of him stood in uniform. Next to him, Ranger, full coat, proud stance, medals gleaming on the harness. The image shook slightly in his fingers. His attorney leaned over. "Mr. Cole, the prosecution thinks you assaulted someone. They say you stole medication from a pharmacy." She hesitated. "Were you even in that building?" He didn't answer. She looked down at the dog. "And why is Ranger still with you?" "Military dogs are supposed to be reassigned after service." Jackson finally turned his head, eyes sunken, voice dry as paper. They tried. He wouldn't go. That was all he said. When Jackson was discharged, Ranger should have been sent to another handler, but every time they pulled the dog away, he snapped, refused food, broke free from cages, escaped from a kennel in Colorado, and was found 3 days later at Jackson's motel door. After the 3rd incident, someone in the system signed it off. They didn't care. One more vet falling through the cracks, one more dog off the payroll, let them disappear, and they did. Life on the streets doesn't come in slow. 1 minute you're a soldier, the next you're begging outside a Dollar Tree, while people avoid your eyes. The war inside Jackson's head grew louder. The flashbacks came without warning. Fireworks became mortars, shadows became insurgents, but Ranger always knew. When Jackson screamed in his sleep, the dog laid across his chest to calm his breathing. When Jackson staggered into an alley, shaking and crying, Ranger stood guard like they were still in Kabul. In the world's eyes, they were nothing. In each other's eyes, they were all that remained. One night, Jackson sat on a bench outside a locked clinic. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His leg throbbed from an old injury, and Ranger was limping worse than usual. Inside that clinic was the medication the dog needed. The arthritis had gotten worse. The limp was becoming permanent. Jackson didn't plan to steal. He only planned to ask, but the door was ajar, no lights, no alarm. So he walked in. 20 minutes later, a man in a suit screamed robbery. The camera footage showed a disheveled black man holding dog medicine in his hands. No one asked why. No one noticed the leash in his hand, or the service tag hanging from his chest, or the silent dog waiting at the door. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor smiled. To him, this was simple. Veteran or not, the man broke into a pharmacy. End of story. But the judge kept staring at Ranger. Not the way a person looks at a dog, the way a person looks at a memory. She leaned toward the defense. Attorney. This dog's military number, where is it from? The young lawyer flipped through the file. S2917, Afghanistan deployment, 4th Battalion. The judge's hand trembled again, and suddenly her voice softened. I knew that unit. My brother. She didn't finish the sentence, just closed her eyes for a long breath. Jackson didn't know what they were saying. He just kept one hand on Ranger's back, fingers brushing the faded scar from the explosion.